This is what your GoPro looks like out of the box, and this is what it's capable of with the correct settings. A lot of you have been commenting saying that your GoPro footage doesn't look anywhere near as good as the footage I've been posting with this. So, let's fix that. Now this isn't only a video about the best underwater settings for GoPros, but I'm also going to show you what I do to edit my footage in post-production and how I transform my dull ProTune footage from something that looks like this to this. Before we start, it's probably worth mentioning that it doesn't really matter what model of GoPro you've owned, as I've used the exact same settings since the Hero 3, the Hero 5, the 7, and now the Hero 10. So it doesn't really matter what you own, as long as your model has ProTune, you can follow along with these steps. Getting started, for underwater use, I always select the highest resolution possible that offers 60 frames per second, so that we can slow down our footage in post and create that dreamy underwater feel. For the Hero 10, that's 5.3K at 60 frames per second, and for anything older than I think the Hero 6, you'll be looking at 1080p. For field of view or lens, I always opt for the wide lens for underwater use. I feel like it gives the most natural look and feel to your footage, as it equates to around 20mm full frame length, so it's not super wide and it doesn't have that really old school GoPro bubble look. On that note though, if you do have super view turned on, definitely turn that off, as that will give you that really old school bubble, blurry edge look, and personally I think it looks pretty bad, so turn that off, opt for the wide lens, and if you are shooting above water, wide is a decent option, but personally that is where I go for the narrow or linear fields of view, as I feel they have a much more cinematic look. Moving on to stabilization, I always set this to one stop below the maximum amount of stabilization offered, as the second you enable boost hypersmooth, or the equivalent on the older models, I feel like it crops in your image just a little bit too much, and to retain that wide field of view that I think looks so good underwater, I just leave it set to standard. Also, underwater I don't feel like we need that much stabilization, purely as the water does act like a bit of a stabilizer. On land though, this isn't an issue, go nuts. Turn on boost hypersmooth, enable horizon leveling, and get that buttery smooth gimbal feel to your footage. For all of the automatic modes, I generally just turn all of these off. I really don't think we need them, and I feel like they mess with my footage just a little bit too much. If you're using an older GoPro, definitely make sure you turn off spot mode and low light modes, as they will seriously cripple your footage. Moving down, we want to enable ProTune. Now this is where we get into the nitty gritty of the camera and where we get access to those finer details and finer controls. In essence, what we want to do in this setting is remove the GoPro's ability to edit the footage for us, which doing so gives us all the power to edit and make the footage look and feel how we want it to in post-production. It takes power away from the camera and gives it to the creator. The first setting inside ProTune is bitrate, and this is basically just a quality slider. We want to turn that all the way up. For shutter speed, I actually always leave this to auto, as changing this on the fly on a GoPro is really difficult. But you want to turn your exposure compensation down to either -1 or -0.5. What this does is it basically tells the camera to expose the image by adjusting your shutter speed to -0.5 stop. This is super important, as it's much easier to save underexposed footage than it is to try and recover overexposed parts of the image. So personally, I just leave this at -0.5 stop. Next up is white balance, and underwater you really want to leave this set to native, as any other white balance mode will basically give you green underwater footage, which is really hard to save in post. Changing this to native gives you more control to adjust the white balance to how you feel looks right in post, rather than letting the camera decide that for you. With your ISO, always leave the minimum ISO set to the lowest value, which is 100, but make sure you cap the maximum ISO to about 800 or 1000. What this is it's basically an artificial brightness slider, but the more you increase your ISO or your brightness, the more grain and noise you get in your footage. So be sure to cap that out at about 800. This next setting is also kind of very similar in its effect on the camera, and that is sharpness. Now the default sharpness on GoPros is always set to high, and this results in a really digital look and feel to the footage, and in many ways is kind of similar to a really grainy or noisy image. So be sure to reduce that either to low or medium. Now personally, I like to shoot in low and then increase my sharpness in post-production if I want to, as it looks a lot cleaner. Moving on to the color setting, we want to turn it off GoPro color and set it to flat. Now what we're doing here is we're basically removing any ability for the GoPro to edit the footage for us, and it gives us way more power in post-production to edit our footage and make it look and feel the way we want it to. Underwater, this is really important as it's this setting when it's left on GoPro color that results in that really green underwater look. Turning it off removes the power from the camera and gives it to us to edit our footage. For the rest of the automatic or audio settings, I usually just turn these off as I don't really use or need them. And if you're shooting photos, most of the above settings that we've just discussed will also apply, but you also want to turn your camera onto RAW mode instead of JPEG. And there you have it. Those are in my mind the best universal underwater GoPro settings. And the best part is, once you've set your ProTune settings once, you shouldn't ever have to go back in and change them. I actually use exactly the same ProTune settings that I do underwater as I do above water, and with all different combinations of stabilization, frame rates, and resolution. But what you're going to see now is probably not what you expected, because your footage is going to look something like this. It's really dull, there's no contrast or vibrance, and it's generally just pretty boring. But remember, a lot of the settings we just changed on our GoPro remove any ability for the camera to edit the footage for us, and rather give us the power to edit our footage, meaning that we do have to put in a little bit of extra work, but the results are well worth it. Now, I'm going to show you how I edit my footage using editing software like Adobe Premiere Pro. If you don't have access to this software, DaVinci Resolve is another really good free industry grade option, and I would highly recommend, if you don't have editing software, that you learn on DaVinci Resolve, purely as it's industry grade and free. I don't know why I'm not using it. And pretty much all the steps I'm going to show you on Premiere Pro are identical on DaVinci Resolve. So, jumping into software. Alright, so we are now inside of Adobe Premiere Pro, and what you're going to want to do is start a new project if you haven't already. I already have one, so I'm going to go down and start a new sequence, and the settings are exactly the same. Starting off, we're going to rename this. And then moving on to settings, we're going to hit the editing mode and scroll up to custom. I'm going to turn this into a 25 frames per second video as I'm based in Australia, and put in 3840 and 2160 as our frame size, which is just a standard 4K image, and then hit OK. So we now have our sequence. We're going to import our footage by going to File, Import, finding the location of our footage, and then hitting import, and that will put our footage over in our project file, and mine is set over to the right. Yours might be located somewhere different, and we're just going to we're going to double click on that, and then this is our, I have no idea what this shot is, it's a random video, but for now this is just the example. We're going to find the bit of the clip we want and hit I to select our in point, and then O to select our out point, and then drag that down, and we'll get a pop-up if our settings are different. This is just because I shot this in 5.3K, and this is a 4K timeline. So first off, just going to scale that back down so that it meets our 4K settings, and this is about 72.2% from memory. Alright, now our 4K frame size matches our clip perfectly. The next thing I'm going to do is go down to our clip, right hand click, and go to speed and duration, and then change the speed to 50%. As we shot in 5.3K 60 frames per second, we can reduce our speed down to 41.6, but I'm just going to leave it on 50%, and now our clip is in slow-mo and looks good. But we don't actually want to edit this clip, so moving on to the files I've actually prepared earlier, a bunch of shark shots that I shot not too long ago on the Hero 10. We have our 3 shots. Now these are just straight out of the camera, and as we can see, they're all pretty dull, pretty non-contrasty, non-vibrant, and they've all got a green hue, which is a pretty standard thing with any camera when you haven't set your white balance. So the first thing we're going to do is click on the clip, go over to the right and find Lumetri color. If that isn't there, head over to window and then make sure you've ticked on Lumetri color, or alternatively head over to effects and just search for Lumetri color and go through the old school way by finding it, dragging and dropping it onto our clip. So now we have Lumetri color in one of the ways we've mentioned. Let's go in and actually start editing our footage. So the first thing we're going to do is fix our white balance, which was set to native, but as we've set it to native, we've got a lot more control over editing it. So I'm going to increase the reds, which is the color we tend to lack underwater, and find a point where I think it looks good. I'm also going to increase the yellows just a little bit, and then move down to the rest of my settings. I think it's a little dark, so we're going to increase the exposure. Maybe the red's a little bit more here. I think that looks pretty good, and then drop the yellows just a touch. And then I am going to go through the rest of my settings in the basic panel. We're going to increase the highlights a little bit just to bring a bit more of a pop to the image. That looks pretty good there, and then reduce our shadows. And what this is doing is it's basically increasing the contrast. So we've darkened the dark areas and brightened the brighter areas, bringing a little more attention to the shark and the water. And that's the same thing with whites and blacks down the bottom here. We're going to increase the whites, which is going to increase the exposure in these few areas and bring a bit more attention to it. And then again, reduce the blacks, creating a nice bit of contrast. Finally, we've got our saturation slider. I'm sure we're all familiar with this, but we're going to increase that a little bit. And then I think maybe tweak our colors a little bit more now that there's a bit more saturation. Increase our reds and decrease the yellow colors. What you can also do is select this color dropper here and then go and click on a white part of your image, and that will automatically figure out a good white balance for you. But for this sake, I'm just going to stick to doing it manually. And that looks pretty good. So there's a bunch of other settings here. We're not going to touch these too much. We'll go into curves on our next shot more properly, but for now, we're just going to input a very basic S-curve. And this again is just lowering the dark parts of our image down the bottom, and up the top, it's increasing our highlights. And we're just creating a nice S here, and that just increases contrast, as you can see here. So we're going to do this on pretty much every shot. And then the rest of these settings, we're not really going to touch too much. So as you can see, the differences between our edits with the two sections, and that is, I believe, our shot. So playing it back through, all right, so we didn't see this. There's a lot of yellow here on the shark. So I'm going to reduce the yellows a little bit here. And what we're also going to do, you can leave it here if you like, but if you want to do something a bit more advanced, we're going to head down to our HSL Secondary, click on the eyedropper, select the yellow part of the image we don't like, and then click on the color mask, the gray color. And we're just going to play around with these sliders here, increasing it and decreasing each slider until we have all of the gross yellow color we don't like. And then I'm going to reduce the yellows, add a bit more blue in, and desaturate them a little bit as well. I think that will just hide that yellow a little bit better. Again, if we think our mask isn't good enough, we can increase it and increase the area of what we're doing here. So this is basically just applying an edit only to the parts that are on screen now. So the yellow underbelly. Turning that off, might add a little bit more blue. Take a little bit away and then desaturate a little bit more maybe. And there we have it. So that's a pretty big difference. Again, it's a little more advanced, but it does make all the difference. So heading back to the start of our clip, I think this is looking pretty good. All right, so moving on to our second clip. Again, it's quite green, pretty dull. There's not too much going for it, but again, it's all filmed in RAW and native. So getting started, we're just going to increase the reds, and that already looks so much better. I might just leave the yellows ever so slightly higher, and yeah, that's huge. Again, let's increase the exposure just a little bit and then boost the contrast up. That just brings down our shadows and brings up our highlights over in these rocky areas. And I think the highlights are a little bright, so I'm just going to reduce these and then also reduce our shadows, which is going to again add a little more depth, reduce the dark parts of the image and make the shark pop a little further. And also our blacks. We don't have too many blacks here, so I'm going to push these quite low. I think minus 60 to 70 should be good enough. Yep. And then again, we're just going to increase our saturation. And as we do this, I'm noticing my colors aren't quite right here. So what I'm going to do to fix it this time, instead of playing with the white balance, is we're going to go down into curves. And again, just with the white and black line, we're going to make a S curve. Again, just creating contrast. But then to fix our colors, I'm going to head over here and click on the red slider. And this is going to edit the highlights and shadows of our red tones. And if we bring this top slider across to the left, it's increasing the reds in our highlights, and then raising our red line down at the bottom, you can see it's adding red back into our shadows. So it's going to bring a bit of red back into these rocks, which are quite green. So I think around there looks pretty good, maybe a little further. You can see it affecting the highlights here. So we're just adding more red into our shot, into specific parts of our shot. And this is a more precise tool than just white balance, and you can see the difference it makes. Also, if that's not enough, which I don't think it is, we can go over to our greens and do the exact same thing by reducing the greens and the shadows by bringing it down and dragging the bottom to the right. And that's just reducing the green and the highlights and the shadows as well. And that's such a huge difference just in that tool there. So I think that's looking pretty good. Maybe just a little bit more contrast here with our S curve. That's looking pretty good there. And then, yeah, nice. All right, so playing that back from the start, you can see the difference we've already made. It's absolutely huge. I think this is looking really good. Again, the difference in our shots. Yeah, no, this is looking great. I'm happy with that. So moving on to our final shot. Again, we can see there's quite a large green tint to the footage, and there's not a lot of contrast or saturation. So the three things we're going to change, jumping straight into this, is adding a lot more red back to the image, which should get rid of that green color. Like that already is a massive difference, just that one slider. And there, like, I'd almost be happy with that. But we're going to push quite a lot further, and we're going to increase our contrast here. Somewhere around 19 is pretty good. We're going to reduce our shadows again, just to boost that contrast, bring down our darks. And similarly with the blacks, we're going to bring down our black colors. Again, there's not too many here, so don't feel afraid to push it. And increase our whites, which is going to bring a bit of a boost to the bright parts of our image, the sky, the fish, the sharks, and then add some saturation. And that's already looking pretty good with not too many changes. All right, jumping down onto our curves again, we're just going to do what we've done in all of our videos so far and add a small S curve to the shot. Again, just adding a bit more contrast. Looks pretty good. And then if we're still feeling there's still quite a lot of green in the shark's body, we're just going to increase the reds. You see how much that changes? Not too much actually. Increase the reds in our highlights just a little bit. And then again in our shadows by increasing that, by raising it, we're going to increase the reds and try and remove that green from the shark. It's a pretty big difference already. And then moving on to our greens, again, I don't like the green on the shark's body. So we're going to try and get rid of that, lower some greens in our highlights, and again, remove the greens from the shark. I think that's looking pretty good. This image is quite blue, but I feel like this tool has helped a lot in changing that. And we can see the difference with each category of our lumetri color panel. All right, so I think that's honestly all we're going to do for this shot. And in 2 seconds, our shot has gone from this to this. And as well, if you are editing a number of clips, in a lot of them you can just copy and paste your edit from the last clip, provided they're shot roughly around the same time with the same settings. So let's disable our color panel there, select our last clip, copy our lumetri color effect, and then we can just paste it, and boom, without doing any edits. These were shot on separate days. I actually think I prefer this edit to the one we just did, to be honest. Let's have a quick look. Yeah, it's quite a lot more contrasty. I like that. Yeah, we can just copy our effect across if we have similar looking footage, and the edit is much quicker if you're looking to save a bit of time. So bringing these together, we're just going to drag them together and add in a very quick song that I've already imported. Let's go with this one. So dragging it onto our audio line, and then we have our 3 clips side by side, all edited with a song underneath. I'm going to select my in and out points, go to File, Export Media, and we've already named it. We're going to ensure that it's in H.264 with our match source high bitrate, enabled audio and video. Go to our video tab, ensure it's 3840 by 2160, the 4K. Enable maximum render. This is new, we're going to change this down to just 100%. Oh, sorry, 100. Scrolling down, enable variable bit rate to pass. So these settings here, 10 and 12, are good for 1080p footage. If you're filming in 4K or 5K, changing these up to 50 and a maximum bit rate of 70 is probably what you're going to want to do to retain a bit of that information. And then make sure you've got your maximum render quality enabled and you're good to go. Hit export and you now have an epic edited underwater video. And that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed and I hope you learned something about how to use and edit GoPro footage. If you did enjoy this, let me know down below and do the thing. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.